Okay, right, on to this afternoon. How wonderful it is to welcome a Bushy boy, born, bred, grown up in Bushy. Welcome to Louis Trup, who I have known and seen for many years about Bushy. Louis' talk this afternoon. Louis is, or Lieutenant Louis Trup, as I should call him, of the Queen's Gurkha Engineers. Is currently the aide-de-camp to the commander of 8th Engineer Brigade and the engagement officer of the Armed Forces Jewish Community. During his 4 years in the regular army, he has commanded a group of Gurkha soldiers during public duties at Buckingham Palace, Tower of London, Windsor Castle, on United Nations peacekeeping mission in South Sudan. He also represents the Armed Jewish Forces community on the Board of Deputies, and his talk today is very apt. His experiences on Operation Rescript, which will focus on the deployment of over 2,000 troops to Liverpool to conduct testing. The talk will seek to bring to light the contribution of the military in the UK government's response to COVID-19. So welcome, Louis, over to you.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thank you as well to Daphne and Ron and everyone for having me on today. It's a real honour to be able to speak to all of you, to see so many familiar faces about something which I've been very fortunate to be involved with. I think COVID has been one of those things that no one can escape it, and being able to be part of the very, very large team that has helped in whatever way to try and help people get through it has been a real honour. And that's, I think, what I want to try and talk about today. So what is Operation Rescript? It is, on the broadest sense, the military's support to the government's response to COVID-19. And on the screen now, hopefully you should be able to see some of the various different ways that the military, the Army, the Navy and the Air Force have contributed. So you will have seen the NHS Nightingale hospitals constructed by Royal Engineers, including the Queen's Gurkha Engineers in London. We have also worked on mobile testing units. So those were often hitting more rural communities to make sure that testing was spread there. Distributing PPE at the very start. Troops were driving around and dropping off masks and gowns and gloves to hospitals. And also our military nurses and doctors were reinforcing the numbers in some of the hard hit hospitals. Now more present, you will have seen perhaps that we've been helping with vaccine distribution and ensuring that it is spread around the country, and also just helping with the workforce, making sure there's enough people to jab everyone. And as well, driving ambulances. We've had helicopters tasked to the NHS, particularly to hit areas in northern Scotland where it's much harder to get health support out there. And of course, supporting overseas territories and international partners. Gibraltar was quite famous for being the quickest vaccine rollout, even quicker than Israel. And that's because the military were able to quickly deploy those vaccines to Gibraltar and ensure that they were well distributed. If I were to give a quick, one line as to what did the military do, or what was the most important bit, it was that we could support planning and rapid delivery. Because in the military, we're trained to respond and make plans quickly to deal with situations that are complicated and involve different places and people, and then act decisively in a very short amount of time. And that's exactly what I experienced when I was employed as the aide-de-camp to Brigadier Fossey, commander of 8th Engineer Brigade. I was deployed to Liverpool to support the mass testing program up there. So I want to talk about my experiences in Liverpool. Obviously, there's a lot more to what happened on Rescript, but I was very fortunate to see it from the very start to the very finish. And it was also the largest troop deployment that was done, the largest single troop deployment done throughout COVID. We had over 2,000 troops deployed to Liverpool, and with for most people around 5 days warning. For me, I was actually settling down to Friday night dinner in Brighton with my girlfriend. She was on half term, and I got a message through saying, just be ready. On Saturday evening, I got the phone call saying, tomorrow morning, be in the Department of Health and Social Care. So Sunday morning, I was in London, and by that evening, we were out and about heading up to Liverpool. So not much time there. I said goodbye to my girlfriend. I said, hopefully see you the weekend, maybe a couple of weeks. And I didn't see her for 2 months. So it was a bit of a rapid turnaround there. So what you should be able to see in front of you is a bit of the ground in Liverpool. For those of you who know, Liverpool as a city has about 500,000 people, but actually as a wider area, Merseyside has been 1.5 to 2 million people. And at the start, we were focusing on the city, but by the end, we were supporting all the different local authorities in Merseyside, including the Wirral, St Helens, and up to Southport. The first question we had to answer was, well, where are we going to put 2,000 troops? There's not really hotels that we could put them in. There's not really any military installations big enough around there. So the solution, which was found in about 2 days, was Pontins. So the Pontins holiday camp up in Southport became the forward operating base for 2,000 troops. Quite a surreal thing to see. We also had headquarters in Altcar, just to the north. Hopefully you should be able to see my my mouse there. But most of the work was being conducted in Liverpool, around here, and our headquarters in HMS Eaglet, which is a naval reserve centre. So who kind of turned up? Part of the benefit of deploying the military is that we have pre-existing command and control structures that mean that if we need to task people and ensure that there's the management in place, we can do it almost at the drop of the hat. And that's what happened. The brigade headquarters, commanded by my boss, Brigadier Fossey, was operating both in Liverpool, but also in the Department of Health and Social Care. And between those two places, we ensured that we could meet the government targets for the testing pilot. We were there ultimately to see if testing a population would reduce the spread of COVID. And how was that going to be delivered? Our task was to try and test as many people as possible in Liverpool using the lateral flow device, which hopefully now you've all aware of, but it's that much quicker test, which has a 30-minute turnaround. For this, we took under our command 6 different subunits, so kind of 6 regiments from across the country, from the very north of Scotland in Inverness with 39 Engineer Regiment, down to the south with the King's Royal Hussars and the Irish Guards who came up from London. You can see how in front of you this organogram shows how we could quickly take them in and create a structure which would work because the army can do that quickly. And that's part of the advantage that led to the military being asked to help so much with the COVID response. Here I've kind of overlaid the different locations they were in, which added another challenge because, as you'll know with COVID, part of the trouble is when people move, if they're infected, they take it with them. So we had to create a kind of biosecurity bubble with people carefully moving in different groups and trying to manage that all at the same time. And again, just to reiterate the point, all this planning had to be done within about 5 days. So that's all fine. With the army, we're used to working with each other and coming up with plans to cover area and deliver things quickly. But something we weren't used to was working with some of the civilian local authorities. And this was what we pulled together really quickly after the first week. Who were those important people we needed to know? We needed to understand, the council, who was running the council, who was ultimately asking for our support. But then also, who were they tied into nationally? Who were the NHS contacts? Who was the director of public health? But also things like what do we do with the bins? We were producing waste coming out of testing sites, which couldn't just be thrown in the normal bin because some of it was clinical. How do we tie into them? then also with the communications. How are we actually going to speak to the people of Liverpool and say, come and get tested? So we had to tie in with the communications team there. All of this coming together created this network here, and we identified some key characters straight away. And actually the most important lesson there was how critical it is to understand that local environment before you start working. It's something that we in the military study quite extensively, predominantly because of experiences in places like Afghanistan, where if you understand who's the important movers and shakers in the local community, you can have a greater effect and reduce the risk against your troops. We applied those principles, in this case, to Liverpool City Council, and it was really effective. So I mentioned about turnaround planning. Now, this very, very confusing slide is trying to bring out the point that we could use our training, we can use our knowledge of how to conduct operations in different spaces, and then just apply that to the problem of how to test people in Liverpool. We weren't, using our guns and our planes and artillery. Instead, we were using tests. And so it was almost like you would replace what you might have otherwise done with a troop with certain weapon systems, instead with different testing sites. And these testing sites, which we identified, were really broad. Some of them were church halls, some of them were community centres. We also did testing which went from school to school on a regular basis to ensure that the students were getting tested every week. Again, throughout all of this, the purpose of us being there was ultimately to tell the government, the national government, whether testing was the way forward. Something else that we used quite extensively was our mapping knowledge. So as a Royal Engineer, this is something that I'm particularly interested in. We're responsible for producing the maps and producing the geospatial data, which is used in all military applications. But what we wanted to answer here, and what you can see on the board, is a breakdown of the different wards of Liverpool, but overlaid with the neglect and deprivation index. So the darker the blue, the more we had to hit those areas, because those are the areas where people weren't getting tested. Generally, people were poorer and so less likely to get tested because of the threat to their livelihood. They would lose their income because they were unlikely to have sick leave, more likely to be on 0-hour contract. And by combining this data, we could then see where to put our sites. So instead of just going for everywhere, we could be clever and tactical and try and hit the important places. And this approach, which we developed in Liverpool, has now been spread across the country. And here you can see that coverage. We identified that in certain areas, people wouldn't be willing to travel more than 800 meters to a testing site. People would say, oh, well, it's a bit of a long way to go. I don't want to expose myself to people on the street. I don't want to necessarily have to drive. So that's why we then had to add this kind of data on top. And what this produced, ultimately after a couple of weeks, was a data-driven approach, where we tried to get as much data as possible to inform the decisions we took as to where to focus our attention. Again, on that data-driven approach, what you'll see here is each line represents a site, and where it's red is when we had the most footfall, and when it's blue is when we had the least. Here we could start to see the effectiveness of things like media campaigns. After the 9th of November, it's marked on there, we had an increase in people coming to the sites, but we also started to see that people weren't really coming in the mornings in some sites, because it was in places where people would be going to work. But in other sites, we saw that people were coming in the morning because it was near to schools. So parents doing the school run would drop off. What this gave us was detail at a really local level. And by having that understanding, even though we were talking about over 50 sites, we could really tailor each site to be most effective. Again, we also, as well as having this big data, we had on the ground information. We had troops and troops with a lot of experience at each site who would say to us, well, actually, what people are saying is it's too early for me, or it's actually too far to come, or I don't really want to have to come again. And by getting that information at every different site, we then start to understand the different communities living in Liverpool and understand how each different community needed to have certain specific things to think about or considerations going forward. And actually, I'm going to come back to that nearer the end when I talk about some other points. So showing that data on the screen here, you can see some of the data we collected from the first part of our time in Liverpool. So this was over the first 9 days, doing close to 250,000 tests. This increased, and by the end, we had tested statistically half of the population of Liverpool, but that includes a lot of different tests. And I think what's important from here is that you can kind of see how rapid deployment, a big focus, can actually produce a lot of tests and a lot of impact. Ultimately, by the time we left, which was at the end of the second lockdown, so coming towards the Christmas break, Liverpool went from having over 1,200 cases per 100,000 to less than 100. And that meant that Liverpool actually went into tier 2. When we were speaking to the local council, they estimated that the value of that difference was to the tune of the hundreds of millions of pounds per week. So for the Liverpool economy, that was critical. Even though a short amount of time, it really made a big difference. Another thing which we were testing whilst we were there was ourselves. No one had really used testing to understand how to prevent the spread of COVID amongst a workforce. Whether it's an office, whether it's a military unit, or whether it's a hospital where the staff need to be protected, we conducted detailed research on our own troops who were being tested once every 3 days to try and understand what methods can be used to prevent the spread amongst 2,000 people working together. This is where we developed concepts like bubbling and staggered testing, so that you would have tests for different people at different times to try and catch any outbreak as soon as possible. Of course, we were doing things like isolation, but using the doctors who were with us were doing detailed tests to understand how long they needed to isolate for, what kind of isolation they needed to conduct. And that information which we collected has now informed how the army, but also wider some of the government policy on those factors, on how to prevent spread amongst populations. Now, I spoke a lot about the military, but actually one of the first things for any military contribution is to understand how can we sustain it. And ultimately, our job in the military, whilst being to support the government, be that the local or the national government, we also have to think about how that's going to work forever. And we can't be stationed doing this kind of work indefinitely. And so we looked towards that transition. And what that meant for us was training local people, volunteers, local authorities, NHS staff, in how to set up and deliver testing in a local community setting. You can see here some of the various different numbers and detail, none of which is exactly how it ended up happening. These were the plans, and as we say, no plan survives first contact. Everything always changes. But ultimately, we spent a lot of time working on that transition, making sure that we trained other people to deliver it. We trained somewhere around 1,000 people locally in how to run a testing site. And that wasn't just Liverpool City, that was the whole region. We produced a course, essentially, a short course, which taught everyone from, so you could turn up there having never done anything to do with anything clinical or medical before, to being able to run and test people coming through a site. What's now happened is that then has transitioned to control of the local authorities in Liverpool, and they then used a combination of contractors and their own employees to ensure that the testing could continue to try and keep the levels down in Liverpool. This transition model is pretty much what has also been adopted elsewhere in the country, trying to figure out how, when the second the military come in, we have to look at how we train and empower those in the local community to deliver it further. So I just, on this slide, want to talk about some of the things that we learned. And I've mentioned it throughout, that lots of everything we were doing, because it was a pilot, nationally directed, we were feeding in what we were learning on a daily basis, ultimately to number 10. And I was, unfortunate enough to be in many calls with both the Prime Minister and Dominic Cummings, who also was very interested in this at the time. And people like Baroness Dido Harding attended and came to visit us. And there was a lot of that kind of interest to understand what we were figuring out. We learned that we had to engage with the local community, not just those structures that already exist, but faith communities, the smaller communities. We had a testing centre in the Caribbean Community Centre, where every day the troops working there were provided with a really nice hot lunch by the local community to say thank you for what they were doing. We also learned about the technology. The lateral flow device hadn't really been used before, and what we learned, we managed to pass on to the other providers of lateral flow devices today. We also learned about how to set up a site. What is the most effective way? What makes people feel comfortable? For many people, they hadn't left their house until this point. If you remember this, we're talking in November last year, and for many people, they had not been out at all. And it was really important to us to make sure that people felt comfortable, felt like there was enough space. And so that's why we developed various different methods. And then finally, that data-driven approach really meant that what we were providing was effective and really took into account the various different considerations that needed to be done, and tying that in with the NHS, with the local authority, the directors of public health, meant that we were getting a concerted effort. We were fully including everyone in that team and delivering to as the greatest effectiveness as possible. And so here we go. So these are the kind of lessons that we learn. Firstly, about securing defense outputs. We as the army, but across defense, still have to deliver what we do around the world. I'm working on the support to the United Nations mission in Mali at the moment, the peacekeeping there. I know people who have been out around the world conducting various different things, not at all related to COVID, but we still had to protect that. We learned how to do that over this time in Liverpool, and we use those lessons to this day. The second one here is narrative and incentive. We found that it was really, really hard to get certain groups of people to come to the testing centres. It was really hard to get people who were on lower incomes, or were having or were employed in 0 hours contracts, or in some kind of employment where if they didn't turn up to work, they just wouldn't get paid. If you weren't going to get paid, why would you get tested? Because if you find out you've got COVID, you have to isolate. So things like that, we fed into that national discussion. We also had a lot of people spreading misinformation. Some of our troops who were working on sites were abused by local people, saying that it was a conspiracy theory. We had to identify that quickly and feed that into some of the narrative and the messaging that the government was putting out, and still do to this day. Third here is that flexible delivery I mentioned before. We had to learn how to adapt to different places and ensure that everyone from different backgrounds felt comfortable taking part in the testing. Young, old, rich, poor. And then finally, this was our kind of slogan by the end, that the military represents the center, is the center of government almost. It's enabled, we are enabled by them, and then we can go out and catalyze. We can help local authorities do things quickly with a very short turnaround to a really large scale. But ultimately, there's that transition required to that local delivery. And that's something which we now know needs to be considered at the very start. If you're not thinking about it, you're too late already. So just to kind of finish up, I want to talk about my personal experiences, because this for me was an amazing, if not quite surreal deployment. We're used to going around the world, and as mentioned, I've been to South Sudan, recently came back from Morocco. We're used to that kind of thing and doing war fighting, but this was very different. On the left, you'll see me in front of Anfield, the Kop, for the football fans amongst you, and seeing how particularly Liverpool Football Club embraced the military and the whole program was quite amazing. We went to visit them for lunch, and they had laid on the food which they provide for their, very expensive boxes for the corporate provision. They gave that to the troops to say thank you. In fact, when it went to when Liverpool was put into Tier 2, they actually hosted a few matches at Liverpool, and they gave 2 boxes to the troops to say thank you, which was an amazing thing to see, but also a really kind gesture. And it showed to me how grateful people were for the work that we were doing to try and help the city. In the middle here, and actually all these 4 pictures here, you'll see that what we found ourselves in was what I would describe as a media circus. We had visits from the Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, down there. This was an interview with the US, I think it was CBS, or one of their big, or NBC actually, one of their big news outlets there. And here's meetings with the mayor and other characters like that, because the pilot scheme in Liverpool was of interest to everyone trying to fight COVID around the world. And to be a part of that was quite amazing, but also meant that we were under the microscope, and everything we were doing was being really closely watched, and we had to be really careful, because were we to make mistakes, that would have been broadcast internationally. I also got to have a pretty interesting day out to Number 10. Some of you who watch the regular press conferences conducted by the Prime Minister may remember that my boss, Brigadier Joe Fossey, who you can see here, spoke at one of those press conferences about the mass testing in Liverpool. For me, I'd never been in Number 10 before, and to see that political machine churn was quite incredible. And as much as the people have different views on the government and different characters within it, what I was found really outstanding was that people really cared. People saw that we were the team from Liverpool, and were asking us, how's it going? What have you learned? What can we do to improve? How can we try and help the other cities in the country and the rest of the country and the world? People really wanted to understand how to make those improvements and make a positive impact on the nation. And I also got to get a nice fly in a Chinook from Liverpool Airport down to RAF Northolt to speed the journey, which was another good experience. And I said I'd come back to it. And what I mentioned a few times is that we learned that we had to understand the local community. And for those of you who know Liverpool, some of this may not be new, but Liverpool's a fascinating mix of different cultures and religions. It's one of the highest proportion of Catholic population, or one of the largest Catholic communities proportionately in the country. And it's also got a very large Chinese community. In fact, it's one of the oldest Chinese communities outside of China, being over 500 years old. And straight away, we identified that these different communities were critical for us to engage with in order to promote the idea that people could go and get tested. And so, on the left, you'll see the inside of the Catholic cathedral in Liverpool. In the centre is the Protestant cathedral. And on the right is somewhere close to my heart, which is the Prince's Road Synagogue. And here, holding up the Sefer Torah, you'll see Rabbi Moshe Ariel Abel, who, as well as being the rabbi of Prince's Road Synagogue in Liverpool, is also an army cadet chaplain. And he very kindly opened up the synagogue to us and gave us a tour and told us some of the amazing stories. And if you ever are up in Liverpool in the future and you haven't been, and you know everything's open after COVID, I really recommend going to visit what is one of the most beautiful synagogues I've ever seen, around, and that's around the world. It really is quite an outstanding place. And for me, I always try to be actively Jewish in my service. I always tell people I'm Jewish. I don't shy away from it. And I always try and organize things or do things related to Jewish festivals or the Jewish community. And so that's why we ended up having this, which I'll quickly try and show you here.
Eloheinu melech haolam, asher קידשנו במצוותיו, וציוונו להדליק נר חנוכה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, שעשה ניסים לאבותינו בימים ההם בזמן הזה. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם, שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה.
Did you manage to see that video? I'm not sure if that showed up.
We heard it, Louis, but we couldn't see it.
All right. Well, what I'll do is I'll quickly just share here. Hopefully you can see this now. But this is a video.
Yeah, see that.
Yeah, this is a video which was posted on the Army's Twitter, which shows part of the team who are up in Liverpool doing the first night of Hanukkah candle lighting, led by Padre Abel, Rabbi Abel. And what I think is significant about this is that, you know, this is something that we're very used to as Jews, as people who are engaged with our Yiddishkeit. But actually, what was quite outstanding for me is that this was shared on the Army Twitter account. The Army Twitter has something like 250,000 people following it, and it was retweeted across the world. And what it sent out was a message that those in the British Army embrace the Jewish population, but also that the Jewish population of the UK continue to support the armed forces and continue to serve. And so I think if I were to say, you know, something that I really value and really take away with much pride is that service and that commitment that the Jewish community continues to have to the armed forces, and in this case to helping do our little bit to help with COVID. So that's really really it from me. I wanted to leave as much time as possible for questions. Please feel free to ask me anything, not just about the actions up in Liverpool, anything else, but hopefully that was a nice little overview for you.
It was wonderful, Louis. Thank you so much for that insight. Excuse me. I suppose when you signed up, you didn't think you'd get 23 days in Pontins, did you? That's a real added benefit for you. I actually did see that Downing Street briefing when your boss was on, and he came across so articulate, so confident, so clear. When we're used to politicians who are a little bit off the cuff and trying to skate around the issue, he was so clearly defined in what he was saying. I think he gave me a high degree of confidence that, thank goodness, the military was involved and would take responsibility. And I suppose we do have to say thank you through you to the military for all they have done and all they're continuing to do, because their distribution of PPE, and I think they're still distributing vaccines across the country and will continue to be involved for some time. And I think without their military knowledge, skill, and the way of getting things organised quickly, which was so important, as you rightly said. And I can't imagine being a military man yourself, where everything is so structured, so well defined, how you cope dealing with local authorities. I know in my role in other areas, when I've had to deal with local authorities, decision making is not one of the fastest activities they're known for, but clearly what you had to deal with, you needed quick decisions, quick ability to move on and get things done, which is what you did. So really grateful, thanks. And you know, when you said goodbye to your girlfriend, you thought just for the weekend, and 2 months later must have been quite something for you. But really our grateful thanks to you, all your colleagues and the whole of the military for what they, as I've said, what they've done and what they continue to do. Right, okay, questions from people out there. If you can just make yourselves known.
We have Rita, and then
Leslie.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, go on, Rita.
Yeah, thank you ever so much. Very, very interesting talk, and thank you very much for what I've done and will do in the future. Now, one question: why did they choose Liverpool? Why not, I don't know, Manchester or whatever, London?
It's a very good question. There were a few things that came together to mean that Liverpool was selected for the city-wide pilot. The first was the size. Had it been London or Manchester, it was too big, and it couldn't really have been conducted with the number of troops or with the resources that we had at that stage. Had it been successful, then it would have been likely rolled out further in Manchester and London, and to some extent it was, but they wanted to start with a more manageable size. That's the first reason. The second reason is it was a lot down to political agreements that were kind of happened quite quietly, I think, between the mayor of Liverpool and individuals in Whitehall. And I think that there was a willingness in Liverpool to take a risk and to try something new, to try and solve the problem. And Liverpool actually has a history of public health programs which are a bit more experimental, particularly to do with cholera, I think, back in the 50s and some other things. So that background, alongside the political will, as well as the perfect size and scale, meant that Liverpool was the place chosen. And that decision, that choice was made by number 10. That was a top level decision.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much.
Okay, Leslie.
Leslie, and then,
Hello.
then
Thank you.
Marlene.
Thank you so much. That was absolutely fascinating. As an ex-Liverpudlian, it was particularly interesting because we also heard from some of our Liverpool friends how this affected them and what was going on. Particularly lovely was seeing Prince's Road, and I agree with you, that was our local shul, and or at least it was the shul we belonged to. And it is a very beautiful building. But it was a fascinating exercise and very interesting that it was Liverpool. Thank you.
Thank you, Leslie. Marlene?
May I add my thanks to you and everybody in the army for everything you've done. But there's one question which I suppose one always has in mind. Your whole time in the army, have you ever had any anti-Semitism shown to you?
No, I've been really fortunate, and I actually think that the majority of my Jewish colleagues have also not experienced anti-Semitism. If anything, there's a really interesting challenge that a lot of us face, and I get this all the time, which is, you know, if you look at something like, you know, many of you will know the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and in it refers to things like split loyalties. You know, how we as British Jews might actually be more loyal to Israel than to the UK, and that's a anti-Semitic trope which is defined within that definition. But interestingly, often that question doesn't really come from non-Jewish people, but from Jewish people. where Jewish people will often doubt my loyalty either to the United Kingdom or to Israel because of what I do. And whenever I speak to friends, I went to JFS and have grown up within the Jewish community, people will say, "Oh, what do you do?" "Well, I'm in the army." And they say, "Oh, what, the Israeli army?" Because no one thinks, what was a nice Jewish boy doing in the British army? But actually, there's such an amazing history of British Jewish people serving in the British army that unfortunately isn't so well known. And obviously that's not anti-Semitism, but it's a misconception which I often face, and I do find quite funny.
Louis, can I ask one, please? You talk about what's a nice Jewish boy doing in the army. Can you go back a little bit and tell us why the army and your career in the army, how it's progressed? Because you've reached a senior level now, so be interested in your early days and why the army was right for you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, and I think I see it in two. There's two sides to the reason why I joined the army. The first is the job. For me, as an army officer, I had some of the best leadership training in the world at Sandhurst, and then I took command of a troop of 30 Gurkha soldiers straight away as a leader, as a manager, to really testing places and to do a variety of different jobs that were physical but also international and for me interesting. Those are all things that I really wanted to do, and often that desire to be to be in leadership positions and to see much of the world came from my Jewish background. I was involved in BBYO, B'nai B'rith youth organization, and there I was a young leader, and from there, and traveling around as you do with the youth groups, I think that was a large reason why that job mattered to me. So that's the first side of the job. The second side is as many of us do, I learned more and more about the history of this country, the history of the Jews in this country, and I increasingly felt particularly proud to be a British Jew. I'm a really strong believer that as Jews in this country, there is a lot that the country may do wrong and politics happens, but there's actually an amazing amount that the British, that the Crown, that the United Kingdom has done for Jewish people, be it from when they were readmitted into the country, and particularly through the Holocaust. And I thought, actually, I really like the idea of being able to continue that amazing history and to continue the service that British Jews have shown to the United Kingdom, and to show how grateful we are for that which has happened before. And so I kind of have both the practical thing of I quite like the job, but also a more conceptual, moral, ethical side, where as a Jewish person, I think it's a really brilliant way to say thank you.
And did you go from you? Sorry, somebody else, Ronnie? There?
Yeah, we got Irvin here, and then Mr. Lever at the bottom subsequently.
Okay, Irvin.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes.
Clear.
Right.
Carry on.
I don't suppose when people sign up for the army that they imagine that they're going to be doing this sort of thing. I can't imagine the average squaddy thinking he's going to end up being a sort of a nanny. I wonder, can you tell us how the average soldier, ordinary private soldier, reacts to having this sort of role?
It's a really good question. And it's a question that actually is not just come up through COVID. The military have supported things like flooding across the country. They've helped. I don't know if you remember, there was the Whaley Dam a couple of years back.
Yeah.
And troops were sent there to go and fill up sandbags to stop the local area flooding. So it's not the first time that troops have deployed to support what we might call homeland resilience. And so it is something that is spoken about through training. But you're right. The average soldier signs up because they want to go see the world. They want to, be a soldier. And in 9 times out of 10, people are a bit confused or a bit reticent about doing UK operations. But what I would say is that COVID was a bit of an exception. Because COVID affected everyone and everyone saw their family and their friends stuck at home, I think there wasn't anyone in the country who wanted lockdown to continue. And so for even, we had a private soldier, a gunner actually, who was 17 years old from Gibraltar, who I was speaking to. Amazingly eloquent young man. And he said, hey, look, at the end of the day, what would I be doing in this situation? What else would I be doing? I'd much rather be here helping out in some small way than kind of stuck at home. Particularly because the average soldier is not the person who likes to sit at home on a computer screen, but wants to be out and about doing something. So in this specific case, people were really keen to help out. And it was really quite inspiring. And there were a lot of amazing stories and quite a few honours and awards presented to many of the soldiers who took part because there was such enthusiasm.
Thank you.
No worries.
Who is that?
It's Alan Lever.
Hello, Alan. How are you?
Hello, Stuart.
Nice to see you.
Yes, to see you. Nice too. Louis, thank you very much for a brilliant erudition of your experiences. I'm jumping off the subject slightly. I served in Malaya in national service with the Gurkhas in 1951, 52, 53. That's apart from the subject. At the moment, my dear granddaughter Erin is serving in South Sudan as a midwife at BNTU. I'm just interested in your involvement in South Sudan, of your experiences there, and maybe you can enlighten us all.
That's probably the topic about which I'm secondly most passionate about is South Sudan. It's a fascinating country, and I'm sure you've heard about it from Erin. But for everyone else, the country of South Sudan is the newest, it's the youngest country in the world, and it's since its independence in 2012, it's had a ongoing civil war between various different tribal groups and factions. And so there's also been simultaneously the United Nations mission in South Sudan, which is a peacekeeping mission as well as a humanitarian mission. My experience there was that I was stationed up in Malakal, which is on the banks of the River Nile, and was once the second largest city in South Sudan. But because of lots of the violence, certain ethnic groups have basically been forced to flee and are now all together in what's known as a protection of civilian camp. What that means in practice is it's a refugee camp, but around it, it's being protected by UN peacekeepers, including us, to stop any of the other tribal factions attacking those different tribes who are seeking refuge there. My role there, because I'm an engineer, what my responsibility there was actually constructing hospitals. And so my time in South Sudan, so I was there for 4 months, from 2019 to 2020. And my time there was spent constructing a hospital to be used to support the local population there.
Is that where Erin is? She's with Médecins Sans Frontières.
In Malakal.
In BNTU.
In BNTU. So BNTU was I was in Malakal, and there was another squadron station in BNTU. So that was the other place where British troops were stationed. However, now that operation, the British commitment to the United Nations mission in South Sudan has now shrunk. So it was 300 at a time, and now it's only a few people working out of the capital, providing staff planning support. And most of our UN efforts picked up from South Sudan and moved to Mali, to MINUSMA. And that's where most of the British Army's focus now is in terms of UN peacekeeping in Africa.
Do you think she's safe there?
I think so. So I was partly responsible for some of the protection within the area, and that includes the non-government organisations like Médecins Sans Frontières, and they are safely within the bubble provided by the peacekeepers. And all of the peacekeepers I met there from across the world, we had Rwandan peacekeepers, Mongolian peacekeepers, people from Bangladesh, India, all over the place, were incredibly professional. And I always felt very safe inside the wire there. If anything, particularly during when I came back, because it was COVID, it was probably safer in South Sudan than it might have been back in the UK. So I'm fully confident that Erin is safe, and I think what she's doing is absolutely brilliant out there. The work that I've seen MSF do is absolutely, it's awe-inspiring actually.
Nice to see you, Alan. Thanks for joining us down on the south coast there.
I have a question or two. First of all, we've seen a number of really good presentations on Sage on a Tuesday, but I have to say yours was one of the most fascinating I've seen. I'm particularly impressed, and I have a question on it. Who produced all those slides with the details? Because really, there's so much work gone into that. That's that. And the other comment I will make: a lot of us here fondly remember your grandfather Cyril, and he would have been very proud of you.
Thank you very much. I often think about my grandpa Cyril. I know that he had an amazing way, from my recollection, of being jolly in the face of adversity, and it's something which in the army you require in spades. And I often think of him in difficult times, because I know that he would always put on a smile and crack on. I was very fortunate to know him growing up, and I think he was a very large influence on me, particularly, as I say, about understanding the British connection and the British service to this country in its broader sense. In terms of the slides, so what you've actually been fortunate to see is a slide pack that I pulled together, which we presented to people, including the Defence Secretary, and to various senior officers, including the Chief of the General Staff and the Chief of the Defence Staff. It was the work of other people feeding in, but one of my responsibilities was trying to pull those together for those briefings. I would say I unfortunately couldn't include everything, because lots of the stuff is still marked as sensitive. But I think one of the important skills that the military provides is that ability to pull together data, images, information, and try and convey it. And I think that's something which is a brilliant skill. And I'm sure that I'm sure that if you meet anyone from the armed forces, they'll hopefully be able to give you as good, if not better, a presentation.
But I presume that there are specialists who produce the detail.
To some extent, but that planning process, so all of the work you see is the result of our planning process. And without getting into too much detail, everyone in the army particularly learns the same planning process, be you a lance corporal all the way up to a general. And the reason, and we have the same set of 7 questions which go through a process that allow us to plan for things. And they produce, as a result of those questions,
I think actually means the physical.
It produces different products, some of which you see there. And it's one of the greatest, one of the greatest strengths of the army is its ability to plan and produce these kind of products. And I think that's part of the reason why we had military planners posted into pretty much every government department in Whitehall, as well as almost every local authority in the country, because that ability to plan, to quickly come up with an idea and then ensure that it's backed up with data and information is almost the core skill required of those of us in the army. So
thank you.
No, you're more than welcome.
One more question for Louis before we let him go. I'm sure he's got important things to go off and do. No? Just one quick question for you. Did you go straight to Sandhurst from university?
No, so at the end of university, I worked for a year in the student union. So I served as president for a year, which was a paid job. And then during the process of applying for the army, applying for Sandhurst, I did various other jobs, kind of one in cybersecurity, one in working in Parliament, just to kind of keep me going until I started in Sandhurst.
Okay. Just before I hand back to Daphne, because I'm sure she'd like to say thank you. We've had today quite a unique thing. We had your dad on a couple of years ago, and we've had you today, so it's the first father and son presentations that we've had. So it's a first for us. So thank you so much for me. It's been lovely seeing you again, Louis, and I wish you well and keep safe for the future. Daphne?
I just want to say a personal thank you for agreeing to talk to us and for giving us such a wonderful talk. I know that everybody who was here with you really, I'm sure, found it absolutely fascinating. And I'm pleased that you still came even after you couldn't come to us last time. And yeah, I mean, just be safe and look after yourself. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daphne, and the same to all of you. It's a real honor to be able to speak back to the community which you come from, and you know, it takes a village to raise a boy, kind of thing. And I do feel very much the proud product of Bushy, and Bushy plus our satellite communities on the south coast, and I hear in Spain as well or something. So yeah. It's a real honor, and hopefully, you know, please do all stay safe as well. Get tested when people offer you the tests, and you know, hopefully see you all face to face soon when this is all receded a bit more. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you from boy to man. What a story. Thank you so much.
Thank
really
you.
Great.
Thank you.